Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Jordan, Executive Director of the Business Civic Leadership Center, and this is Conversations with Stephen. Today, I'm joined by Doug Pinkham, President and CEO of the Public Affairs Council, and again, staffing the news desk is Aman Singh, Editorial Director of CSR Wire. Before we kick it over to Aman for the news, what I thought we would do, Doug, is start off by telling us a little bit about the Public Affairs Council, yourself, and about the Pulse survey that you guys just came out with in July.
Okay. Well, Steve, it's certainly a pleasure to be part of this program. I know you have a wide following. The Public Affairs Council, for people who aren't aware of us, we were created in 1954 at the suggestion of President Eisenhower, who felt the business community needed to learn to be a bit more proactive and strategic in how it dealt with greater society. You didn't hear terms like corporate social responsibility. You didn't talk in terms of strategic government relations. You had people who worked in PR and people who were lobbyists. And most of the time they were putting out fires and dealing with crises. And very few companies at that time sat back and said, how can we avoid crises to begin with, and how can we be more strategic in all of our stakeholder relationships? So we started out, we're a 501c4 organization.
I'm sorry, what's a C4?
A C4 is a social welfare organization, not unlike a trade association or a charitable foundation. By law, we can be engaged to a certain level in politics. However, it's in our bylaws that we don't lobby and we don't take any stances on public policy positions. We have roughly 630 member organizations. Most of them are Fortune 500 companies. We also have consulting firms and nonprofits. And sometimes I'm asked by a member of the news media, what's our political agenda? And the answer is we don't have one, because our members include the Minnesota Vikings, the Mayo Clinic, and Chevron. And they don't agree on much. So the luxury of my job is I don't have to get them to agree.
Except, sorry, I do have to say they're right now, one thing that almost everybody in the United States seems to agree on is the substitute refs.
Refs, replacement refs. I noticed Romney and Obama actually agreed on that
That's
as well.
right.
I think everyone agrees it's an aberration, and an abomination. But you know what we.
But they do agree on your agenda, which is basically training.
That's right. It's training and best practices. It's the idea that good ideas get invented in many different places. Different companies do different things particularly well, and we bring them together across different industry sectors and with the nonprofit sector to talk about best practices.
Now, you're no stranger to CSR. Right? You've actually been kind of following corporate social responsibility for a while.
Well, I have. I've been in this position for 15 years. Mm-hmm. I'm the third president, actually, of the council in 58 years. Previous to this, I was a VP of communications with the American Gas Association, which is a big trade group for gas distribution companies, and I was in charge of our foundation and CSR programs. But in addition, I was on the board for the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship for probably 10 years. And we do programming in that area, although most of our programming is in the government affairs and then larger public affairs sphere.
Right. So tell us, we're going to do a pretty deep dive into the Pulse survey, but tell us a little bit about, give us the background, set us up for the rest of the conversation.
Well, one of the things that we've talked about within our board and within our membership the last several years is very few surveys have been conducted on public attitudes about big business. And we went back 30 years to Gallup and Pew and the major polling firms and looked at questions about public attitudes on business. And generally speaking, they asked two questions. Do CEOs make too much money? What do you think the answer is?
No.
Yeah, well, you're wrong. The answer is typically yes. And secondly, and see if you can get one for two, do companies have too much power and influence?
That's a tough
You're probably
one.
going to say no.
Can I pass?
Yes, you can do that, but they can't do that in a survey, but most people would say yes to that. But there was very little asked about public expectations for business, or what about people who aren't CEOs? What's your level of trust with middle management? What do you feel a company's proper role in society should be, and how do you compare it to your views on government? So we wanted to do a nonpartisan, completely non-political poll, and our first challenge was finding a polling firm that was nonpartisan, because there really aren't very many. And we wound up choosing Princeton Survey Research out of New Jersey, which does the major survey work for the Pew Center. And that also gave us access to previous data from previous Pew polling. So that gave us the credibility and the experience we felt we needed. So this is the second year we've now done it 2 times.
And one of the other things about this is that Pew has actually been doing a global survey of world attitudes around business. So this must have tied in very nicely. Well, good. So we're going to delve into kind of a deeper look at public attitudes towards trust. But before we do that, thought we'd turn it over to Aman and see what is going on. Aman?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Thank you again for having me. Lots going on, very busy month. We're still 3 days away from the end of the month, and to do a quick dive of the news for September, just got done with the Clinton Global Initiative, so that's definitely has taken over the airwaves. A lot of companies announcing new initiatives. Before that, last week, it was the Dow Jones Sustainability Index on the Carbon Disclosure Project announcing their members, so we had a lot of members talking about that. Talking about energy and renewables, IKEA has reached 75% solar presence in their stores in the US, quite significant. Ceres launched a very valuable new tool for supply chain assessment. A lot of members have been pretty excited about that tool. They've been saying it's been necessary. We'll see once it starts getting applied what the results show. MetaView and CRD Analytics, which are two financial services companies, they've started what they call a quarterly analyst call for sustainability, obviously tongue-in-cheek to the traditional quarterly analyst calls for financial folks. Their aim is to get the latest updates on news reports and research in the ESG and sustainability arena. We had that. We're partners with them, and we did that last week. A lot of interesting news came out of that, including the recent Dodd-Frank legislation. The National Conference on Corporate Citizenship released a new report last week talking about the connection between civic engagement and employment. They say communities that have a higher number of nonprofits and what they call social cohesion have a lower unemployment rate. So it's a very fascinating study to check out. CSR reports continue to come in. Some of the names include Ryder, Edelman, interesting. When a PR agency puts out a CSR report, it always grabs my interest. Diageo, Miller Coors, General Electric launched a new CSR website. And then beyond that, two really interesting surveys launched. One was Ethical Corps. They released a report on how leading companies are making the business case for CSR and how you can identify new drivers to push the case for sustainability. And the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship has launched their biennial survey on finding out what makes a CSR professional. So anyone tuned in, you consider yourself a CSR professional, I encourage you to take that survey. It produces a lot of great data every 2 years and definitely helps job seekers and aspiring CSR professionals. A lot of grants also announced in September and August. Volkswagen announced a lot of companies announced their work with Hurricane Isaac. Avon was in the news with their Hello Green Tomorrow fundraising campaign. Western Union and ING announced new grants. Chase announced the results of their crowdsourced community giving program, which I encourage everyone to check out. It's really innovative. They get their Facebook users and their customers to vote on which charity should get their grants, and they got 1.5 million votes. So pretty interesting new age technology. And then on the blog front, on our independent reporting side, we have a lot of conversations going on, especially with it being an election year. We've started a new investigative series on the two sides and what their stands are on CSR issues. We put out our first edition 2 weeks ago on their stand on energy, community, and climate change. Fascinating read. Again, encourage you guys to stay tuned in for the rest of the editions coming up. We're also doing some great conversations on workplace giving. We had a really good interview with Tim Moen, who is the CSR director at AMD. We started a new series with them. He's going to help job seekers and CSR professionals understand what does CSR mean for public affairs, for government policy, for community giving, kind of the big universe, and put it in perspective on how do we figure out our careers if what we want to do is have a good job that also helps us make a difference.
A quick question for you. Does CSR Wire kind of keep track of which of these stories kind of spike in readership interest or the relative weight on them?
Yeah, a few months ago we started what we call a top 3 report. Every month we come up with a top 3 report of the top 3 news items that got the most interest. We're either getting a lot of interest on social media as well as traditional media, and we put that out in a top 3 report and send it out. And it's news oriented. A lot of supply chain issues, a lot of reports get people's attention. When Dodd-Frank was in the news, that got a lot of attention. Career-related news is always among the top. Company-specific news, especially when it's bad, always gets top honors. We did a really good article on Mitt Romney and Bain Capital, and kind of in the bigger piece of the private equity model. That got a lot of attention.
Well, without knowing the answer, I would say that CGI, Dow Jones, and Series would probably be the top three right now, or no?
Not Series so much, but Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the Carbon Disclosure Project, which was recent, and CGI for sure.
You know, Doug, as you hear that litany of issues going through, were there any that particularly jumped out at you as being relevant for the Public Affairs Council?
Well, it's interesting how they looking at political candidates and asking what their views are on, you know, what are characterized as CSR-related issues. But then the issues are very broad, like energy. So what's the right position on those issues? And I think what it reminded me is there are various shareholder rights groups out there working, you know, with publicly traded companies trying to change corporate behavior, and some very well intended, some with a very different agenda that the company's stockholders would necessarily support. But it can all get very muddled by how you define what is socially responsible. You know, what is a socially responsible energy approach? I think we'd know it if we saw it. But you know, your definition may be very different from mine and different from someone in the audience. So it all gets very squishy, and I think that can be very challenging for companies when you're being defined by someone else in terms of your behavior.
Mm-hmm. And just one last thing about this, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, can you give people a little bit of background about it? Because, you know, a casual glance at the CSR Wire showed that quite a few companies were very proud of their inclusion in that. What is the Dow Jones Sustainability Index?
It's a pretty comprehensive survey. Companies have to fill it out every year. Some companies are dropped off, some get added every day. There are some that have been on there for years. It's one of the bigger and most recognized indices for companies to kind of say, you know, we're sustainable, we have these commitments, we're following along. I don't know the mathematical calculation of how these companies get in. I'm sure you can find the information on CSR Wire because we cover it very often. But it's one of the more prominent, and starting March, you talk to any company's CSR department, that's what they're doing. They're doing their survey for the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And just before I turn it over to you, I just want to remind everyone, anyone tuned in and not following along with us on Twitter, we are tweeting at #BCLC on CSR. We welcome your questions and join the conversation.
Thank you very much, Aman. And Doug, I think that you really did put your finger on a real question for a lot of CSR professionals, which is the value of ratings and rankings and all of that kind of thing. And that is a perennial favorite debate.
It's a huge issue. If you're a CSR professional, you probably get at least one a month, maybe 3 times a month from some organization asking you to either sign on to a set of principles or telling you to please complete the enclosed questionnaire to see if you are suitably responsible to meet our standards. And one of the real challenges for companies and their executives in this area is to do the due diligence to say, is this a group we want to be associated with? Who else has scored well, who hasn't scored well, what are our competitors doing? There's a lot of work that goes into deciding to respond or not respond, and at the end of the day, you also have to make the decision if signing on to too many of these is allowing outside groups to define who we are. Right. A better model, if you can do it, is internally decide, what are your core principles, what will you do, what do you aspire to be as a company, and then go out and look at all of the various principles and decide which ones are we comfortable with, which ones have a good reputation and credibility with the media and our various stakeholders, as opposed to always having to be reactive. I think the smartest companies are the ones who know the ones they want to be associated with, and then when they're approached by some other group, they can say, we're already, signed on to enough principles, we feel good about it, and here's our strategy, and be very transparent about why we've taken the strategy we have. But too many companies are out there just reacting to something that comes in and trying to decide whether this deserves a response or not.
The other thing that certain companies will say that there's almost a form of political blackmail associated with some of these standings and rankings and things like that. But how much does CSR actually cross over with public affairs?
Actually, quite a bit. And we've done studies where we ask big companies, how much do you coordinate and collaborate between government affairs, I'm going to say that more specifically than public affairs, and CSR. And we find out that companies, will collaborate a certain amount on philanthropy and certain community relations programs. And even there, it's maybe 1 out of 2. But on subjects like issues management, which you would think most companies would coordinate on, it's perhaps 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5. Grassroots advocacy, maybe 15% collaborate. So there's a lot of missed opportunity, I think, because I view, and our organization views, all of these things as related. They're all forms of forming alliances and relationships and making sure your messages are consistent and clear across all different audiences. But many companies operate in silos where they don't necessarily coordinate the creation of alliances and relationships and messaging, and they don't think to do it.
Do you have a theory? Why do you think that is?
Oh, I have theories about most anything, but we don't have enough time to say all of them. But one of them is, I think at a very senior level, let's say you're a senior VP of corporate citizenship, someone else is a senior VP of communications, someone else is in government affairs. At a top level, your jobs aren't that different, really. It's about managing issues and expectations, working with senior management, and communicating to your key audiences. But at the entry level, they're quite different. So if you work in government affairs and you're starting out, you either went to law school or you worked on the Hill, right? Or you worked in a campaign. If you work in communications, you probably came from journalism or you got a degree in PR, and that's a pretty different background than working on the Hill. And in CSR, there's a good chance you worked for a nonprofit or worked in community relations, and that's quite different. But the great irony is at a senior level, they're really not that different. So I think it's just a different set of roots and backgrounds that people have. But I think a smart CEO is going to put these people together and say, we really have got to collaborate. And I think it's in the best interest of each function to collaborate more often.
I actually wrote my master's thesis on trying to study what I called the politics of society versus the politics of the state. And the idea that a lot of what happens outside of government institutions like Congress or the administration or whatever is actually very extremely political. But for whatever reason, we, at least in the United States, we've tended to kind of divide out what happens in society as non-government affairs, and therefore to be treated a little bit differently than what goes on in terms of dealing with these institutions. And yet, what I think is going on is that increasingly government relations folks really need to pay attention to what's going on in society, because that's really kind of the origination. That's where a lot of political movements and a lot of political issues are surfacing from.
And in the same vein, I think that while direct lobbying still has a great impact and will always be with us, grassroots advocacy is growing as a function much more quickly. It's about getting stakeholders behind you and seeing who has an interest in your issues, forming alliances, and getting people engaged in the political world. And that takes more than just political connections and a knowledge of the legislative process. And I think in many ways, social media is actually the bridge between marketing, communications, CSR, and government affairs, because you find an amazing number of issues and strategies in common through the bridge of social media.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So I want to turn now to the Pulse survey. Tell us about the top line findings. Anything that really jumped out at you?
I'll tell you, I'll give you a list of the most surprising findings, because we cover a lot of subjects. Some of the most surprising findings, we ask about overall favorability. What do you think of big business, small business, government? What a surprise, 6 out of 10 Americans don't have a lot of favorable feelings about the federal government. But what is surprising is 67% of adults have at least somewhat favorable view toward big business. I was surprised it was that high, and it actually got better since last year. Now, small business, you can't go wrong loving small business in America, which is why in political commercials, and they say Barack Obama or Mitt Romney support business, it's always posed with a local dry cleaner, or the mechanic, because people relate to small business people. They get a favorability rating of about 90%. But big business did do too badly.
Who are the 10% that don't like them?
I don't know.
No.
Probably big corporate CEOs. I don't know. Maybe it's a very good question. I was on Fox Business and they asked me, who are the people who said federal government was doing a good job? And I think that's an interesting question. But the surprising, real surprising result was when we broke it down by age group. The groups that were most favorable toward big business were actually younger people. And I would not have guessed that, because when I was young, everyone was kind of anti-big business, and then we all kind of mellowed or changed at some level as we got older. But the group that was most favorably inclined toward big business was Gen X, sort of mid-30s to mid-40s, followed by the millennials, age 18 to 35, more favorable than their parents.
And how do you account for that?
Well, I've talked to a number of young people, including people in my interns, my kids, very scientific. And the answers I get is that I think it's, especially millennials, are very pragmatic discerning generation. Nothing's going to be handed to them. They have to look at what they buy, who they align themselves with, and they don't tend to think in terms of broad generalities. And I think this is true in how they look at issues of race and culture too. It's everybody's an individual, and they look at companies the same way. So as my son said to me once, I might love one company and I might hate another company, but what would be the point in disliking business in general? I mean, it's just not typically the way young people think, and I think that's a positive, and should give some hope to people who work within the business community.
Do you think that also, I'm going to jump the gun a second here, that because we associate big businesses with technology now, compared to older generations associating big business, say, with more manufacturing or other industries, that because it's associated more with technology, that there's a halo effect?
I'm not sure. Well, first of all, there's not a lot of data going back a lot of years on this question, and that's one reason we did the survey. But secondly, a lot of small businesses are tech companies, too, don't forget. I mean, a lot of small startups are tech companies. And what is a big company now? You might have I heard a speech by the CEO of Kayak, the travel website, and they have like under 200 employees, but they're a pretty good-sized company. But I think it has more to do with, well, people discern between sectors. Tech companies tend to score well in levels of trust. And those sectors that deal with the more problematic parts of our life don't tend to score as well.
What's the lowest scoring?
Well, the winners, or the losers, depending on how you want to look at it, the lowest scoring sector in our survey was health insurance companies, followed by banks, followed by real estate companies, and then followed by drug companies.
And on the top?
On the top are, we broke out tech into various sectors. They scored 1 and 2, followed by actually beverage companies.
Hold on. So how did you break out the tech?
More like internet companies and more hardware companies.
Okay.
To try to discern between an Intel and a Google.
Okay.
That way. But they both scored at the top. I think people love their smartphones and they love their big screen TVs, and they think it's great that they can have wireless access to the internet. And again, the more problematic parts of their life, especially during an economic downturn, their house has lost value. They don't like to think about health care, and especially insurance. And they've got issues with their mortgage or their bank, and so they don't think well of a lot of those sectors. My message to people who work in those sectors is you got to just deal with the fact that you're probably never going to be popular. And CEOs don't like to hear that, and they'd like to see it change. And I think there's an opportunity, say, for a bank to differentiate between their competitor and them. They might be, the bank with the best reputation for all kinds of measurements, but still, as a bank, you're never going to be more popular than Apple. And it just goes under the category of life isn't fair, that if you're dealing in certain industries, you're never going to score high on trust.
And that's also something that we've been seeing with quite a few other phenomena. People like their member of Congress, they hate Congress. Right. People like their business brands that they know.
They like their company, but they don't necessarily like the sector.
Like other ones.
Yeah.
Well, I want to keep going on this theme, but first I'd like to turn it back over to Amin and see what kind of traffic are we causing. And by the way, I want to issue a challenge. At the last conversation that we had around 400,000 tweet impressions. I want to see if you can break that one, Amin.
Steve will write a personal check to anyone. No, he won't. He should, though.
You got to ask him more controversial questions.
Okay. So what kind of questions do you have?
People are taken in by the statistics Doug mentioned, the 67% figure, the 90% figure. There's a lot of back and forth going on that. One question that did come up before you talked about the survey is, if anyone has quantified the cumulative economic and social impacts of CSR in the U.S.
No.
Big question?
Well,
not in a comprehensive way.
No, yeah, nobody. Well, see, here's the thing: is that people tend to magnify impacts anyway by second order, third order things. So, by the fact that you helped a clinic, you empowered X number of people, and then their families didn't have to have that much healthcare related costs, and so they got helped. And so there is actually no real good rigorous methodology for quantifying the impact of any single thing, because if you actually added up the sum of all these things, it would go much, much greater than our GDP and whatnot, just because of the methodologies that different people use?
It depends what you're trying to measure. Are you trying to measure the overall value of the function? Are you trying to measure impact? And something we often tell people who work in all of these external relations related areas is you got to make sure that your management buys into the value proposition of what you do and not mix that up with measurement, because measurement is really about hitting milestones and performance. So in CSR, it might be meeting a community need. And to demonstrate that, you've surveyed the community, you see what the need is, you deliver your programs with partners, and then you see how you're doing. But that doesn't necessarily justify the existence of the function. I mean, that's a different question.
I couldn't agree more, because for me, the biggest contribution to society that businesses create is the commercialization of innovation, of technology. I think that Thomas Edison and Henry Ford gave gifts that keep on giving to today. And they didn't think of it as social responsibility, they thought of it as meeting a social need. And you invent the car or the phone or the light bulb or whatever, and that's the biggest legacy you can have. When they narrow it down, they're saying, okay, is it jobs created? Is it R&D? Is it, I mean, American businesses spend $1 trillion on benefits, on employee benefits. Is that a CSR thing? You know, is it down to philanthropy, or is it operations?
It gets to that whole issue again of if it's muddled, defining what is a CSR level of support or not. And that's a real challenge for anybody who works in this field. And so my advice would be, within your company, set clear goals of what are you trying to accomplish with the function? What's the business strategy behind the function? How does it fit into the overall business strategy? You know, can you stretch your company to perhaps go further than your competitors and others and make a real difference? But then it comes down to programmatic success, and do you really know your intended audience? Do you know what you want to achieve? Have you set up measurement tools? And in quite a few companies, they do great works, but they don't necessarily have good systems for measuring impact. And that is very important.
Now, another thing that public affairs officers do a lot of is lobbying. Mm-hmm. Is lobbying socially responsible?
Well, it's protected by the First Amendment. There are 5 First Amendment protections, and the right petition government is one of them. So if it's done legally, then it is responsible. Now, having said that, what's interesting in our survey, we asked if a company does any of the following things, do you consider that acceptable or not? And there's a long list of everything, you know, being philanthropic, and obviously people like that, to doing issue advertising, to doing various forms of political engagement and other things. But we said if a corporation spends money on lobbyists or hires lobbyists, is that a good or bad thing? And 56% said it was unacceptable, which frankly is not as bad a score as I thought it would get, given the sort of narrative out there about corporate lobbying and reputation. But 56% negative. But then we got very specific, and we said, okay, if a company lobbies to reduce costs, to create jobs, to level the playing field with competitors, or what if a company lobbies to get grants from government? Is this a good or a bad thing? Every single one of those was above 50%, even the one lobbying to get grants from government.
What scored the highest?
What scored the highest was to create or protect jobs, like 80%.
80%?
Yes. 60 to 70% for scores related to reducing business costs or leveling the playing field with competitors. And I think the takeaway from that is that when you use lobby as a verb and talk about, I'm going to lobby for this purpose, it no longer sounds like Washington politics, which you think about fundraisers and money and schmoozing and what everyone hates about Washington. But now all of a sudden, it's a strategy with a specific purpose. So the advice I've been giving to companies and trade associations is don't talk about, you know, we've got this lobbying office in Washington, but we've got people in Washington who are there to tell our story, to make sure our side gets heard, and to make sure there's no collateral damage when Congress passes legislation. People get that. They understand that. And when
when they see it as something that's like self-protective,
or when you're specific, you know, you're doing it, you're lobbying to reduce costs, to create jobs. Well, okay, well, it's strategy. It's you're trying to influence, you're advocating your role. So in that sense, it's no longer a pejorative term, not like lobbyist and lobbying.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that this is another one of those cases where lobbying in general, like the stereotype of it, is something that never is going to get turned around? Or
it's never going to get. My wife thinks they should just change the name, and she's probably right. I know the American League of Lobbyists had launched a video and a campaign to try to get people to really understand what lobbying is, and within about 2 hours, someone had done a parody of it. You know, I'm sure they put a lot of time and effort, well-intentioned, to get people to like lobbyists. I'm not sure that's going to happen. I think people in this business have to just come to terms with that reality. But that doesn't mean that you just sort of forget about it and feel sorry for yourself. But it means that in your communications, you talk about why you're doing what you're doing, that you become more transparent about your political involvement and why you do what you do, and why you support the U.S. Chamber and belong to your trade association, and why, you know, what the other side is saying about the issues you care about. Companies who are more open about that often find their employees respond very well, because chances are your employees are just as cynical as the general public. And in fact, I would argue your employees right now are your most important audience when you're talking about political engagement.
Why
so
is
talking
that?
about, because
Come on, you can't throw something that provocative
Oh,
out there and not stop on that one.
Oh, sure. I think that this is something a lot of companies underfund and understaff, and that's employee communications. If you are a large bank or a big retail store with hundreds of thousands of employees, if your employees are saying good things about you, there is especially on social media, there is a multiplier effect of goodwill. And if they're saying bad things about you, it's probably an even more potent negative multiplier effect. Doesn't matter if you do PR or advertising or a sustainability report that everyone says is innovative and wins awards. If your own employees are saying bad stuff, that's not good. Cisco is a really interesting example of this, and they were a leader 8-10 years ago ahead of a lot of companies. They had an edict from management to do more things online. You know, let's not use paper. We're Cisco, right? So they created a government affairs portal that was one click off their homepage, and they talked about their public policy priorities and why they had those positions and what the other side said, and here's links to more resources. And after a while, they found that a lot of media and academics and members of Congress and their staff were coming to their website because they had earned their reputation as one of the best sources of high-tech public policy information. That's a nice place to be.
It is.
And then they found their own employees were getting less cynical. Because, I mean, who is more cynical than a libertarian, software designer in Silicon Valley, who voted for Ron Paul, right? So it's a very effective way to actually reach external audiences, build credibility, but also ensure that your own employees know you're not hiding something because you're involved in politics.
So let me ask you this. Earlier in our conversation, you said that in the survey, the X's and the millennials were kind of really getting it, and kind of the older generation wasn't so much. Do you think that there's a little bit of an intergenerational split within the public affairs profession, too?
Yes, I do.
Because of that thing about what you said with Cisco versus...
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say, too, that when we cross-tab the data on favorability, it's not like baby boomers were cynical about big business and millennials, love big business. I mean, baby boomers, of which I am one, and people older than me weren't terribly negative. But it was a few points below where Gen X and millennials were. So there was not a huge split there. But I know within the public affairs profession, there are some splits, especially among people under 40. There's a greater openness to using technology and social media as a strategy to really getting the value of grassroots and how it needs to be an indispensable part of an awful lot of campaigns. There are some folks who are my age and older who totally get that. And there are some who are true traditionalists, in terms of the direct lobbying strategy, and that's the only one they're really comfortable with. But over time, it's changing, and I know a lot of people in their 50s and 60s who have totally embraced new strategies.
Yeah, now, I always get in trouble with these generalizations, and I'm sure
But you don't stop making them.
Of course
yes,
not.
Okay.
Well, because
partly
I enjoy seeing what happens afterwards in terms of sparking the debate. But one of the things that several people within the CSR space have said is that they feel like there's a real distinction in the mindset and the approach between kind of CSR folks and government relations folks, and that government relations folks tend to be like more detail-oriented and more legalistic, because especially in the government relations side, that whether or not the comma's here or it's an A or a the, that actually has major implications.
Okay.
Whereas within the CSR space, it's more like we generally want to build bridges. We generally want to find kind of the common ground, and there's a tendency to not sweat the details, because that gets you in trouble in terms of trying to get to agreement.
Being fluid in forming relationships.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're wrong, Steve.
Thank you.
I think that's a broad generalization. No, I think that the differences between government affairs executives are greater than the differences between your average government affairs executive and an average CSR executive.
Explain.
So you know, people have asked me, what's the right government affairs budget? Or how many people do you need? And I'm like, well, it depends if you make cars or whether you sell smartphones. It depends whether your industry faces controversy, or like the insurance industry, it's regulated at multiple levels of government. There's too many variables. And you do see certain types of, sort of character types, say among health insurance lobbyists. Not that they're all the same, but you see people who are dealing with the fact that they're regulated at multiple levels of government, and many of them have law degrees, and they put as much effort into regulatory relations as they do into legislative work, because it's all about regulations and how they're implemented. You see people in the tech industry, who could have moved over from the sales and marketing department. You see people in the pharmaceutical industry who are extremely capable at third-party alliances and building coalitions, very adept. Some of the smartest people in state lobbying are in the drug companies. So again, the differences almost within the government affairs sector are greater than, I think, between the CSR world. You see people who totally get it in both functions, that this is all part of a broader strategy, that you need to be fluid if you're going to make a deal and form a relationship and collaborate effectively.
Amin, here's actually a question for the audience, is how do they think that government affairs professionals are seen by CSR leaders?
I'm ahead of you. I already asked them.
Okay, and what's the feedback that you're
I
getting?
think they're digesting what you guys are talking about. We don't have feedback yet. I'll report on it.
Okay.
But there's one segue to that about skill sets and responsibilities. If you go back to there's a survey that WineRep Group, which is a recruitment firm, came out with last year that researched what skill sets turn to chief sustainability officers. And the survey found out that people with government affairs experience were a very small percentage of people who end up becoming VP of CSRs and chief sustainability officers. They tend to be more on the PR side, marketing side, as well as more environmental background.
Yeah, I do have to say that, this idea that only 1 in 4 government relations and CSR relations officers sync up on issues is...
it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
I think in many ways. I mean, you think about how one function influences the other. And it reminded me, the whole legislative debate over SOPA and PIPA, which I'm sure you all know very well.
Okay, for the sake of our studio audience,
the Stop Online
SOPA
Privacy Act. This is
PIPA?
the online privacy debate that, came to a head earlier this year. And there were some major players at work, including the U.S. Chamber and the AFL-CIO and the White House on one side, and Google and a lot of tech companies on another side. And one reason a number of legislation co-sponsors changed their positions and a lot happened very quickly on that issue is the tech companies enlisted Wikipedia as sort of the poster child for their point of view. And now Wikipedia is not without controversy, because I know people who've try to change things that are wrong on Wikipedia. But like it or not, Wikipedia is an extremely popular nonprofit organization. And what the lead on the news for a couple of days there was, tell your kids to do their homework early, because Wikipedia is going to be dark tonight and they won't be able to use it. And that all of a sudden got everyone's attention who didn't care about politics and created a tremendous amount of communication to the Hill and phone calls and grassroots energy around that issue. A lot of it had to do, I believe, with Wikipedia's reputation and the fact that tech companies tend to have sort of a halo around them and people think well of tech companies. And I think that's an advantage that they used on that particular issue. So reputation and not necessarily good works unto themselves, but what can result from good works through a stronger reputation can have a legislative payoff. The other area, which I think 2 other areas are important. One is that for a company who's global, who's doing business in Africa, China, India, and other places, you may start out thinking you are making political relationships and business development relationships. Very often it turns into a CSR relationship because there is so much need. And you look at companies like Procter & Gamble and Nike and Cargill and Pfizer and Merck and other companies, they have found to be successful globally, they've got to have a very robust CSR strategy. So it matters there. And then finally, at a time when Congress is like completely dysfunctional, right? I think we all agree on that one. There are still big issues.
No, I'm sure somebody
I'm
out
sure,
there will
would you
disagree.
please tweet us if you don't agree with that? There's an association for people who think Congress is just fine, I'm sure.
It's the 30% in your survey.
That's right. But there are issues where the public, a majority of the public feels strongly about an issue, but where Congress can't reach agreement or you can't get a supermajority around a piece of legislation. And one of those is the environment, which is an issue, despite the bad economy, a lot of Americans feel very strongly about that we need, tough, smart but tough environmental laws. In fact, in our survey, we asked about regulation and found out, well, in general, people were kind of lukewarm about regulation and its value. When you get very specific about environmental laws and so forth, more people felt there wasn't enough regulation than thought there was too much. So on an issue like that, a company may be under increased pressure because Congress won't pass a new law to go beyond compliance in their industry. A lot of activist groups and others who are going to push a company to do more than what it is required to do by law. So it's one of those issues. I think it's good for companies to be aware of public expectations, what the limits of government are, and then have a conversation internally and saying, what are we going to do? I mean, can we use this as a differentiator between us and competitors? Do we have an advantage by doing more? Can we do more as part of our sustainability initiatives because we know the public expects us to do that? But those are issues they're going to have to wrestle with, even if it doesn't turn into direct legislation.
Okay, so several elements of what we've just been talking about, we could go on different parts of it. But what I'd like to do is focus a little bit on the political opportunities that associated with CSR, and also the potential political pitfalls, the liabilities.
Okay.
Do you think that CSR is an underused arsenal in the tool of public affairs?
Yes.
In general?
And my general statement is more and more companies ought to have a strategy where they look at all of their issues, their reputational and policy issues, in the same conversation, think about what are most important and where can they have the greatest impact, score them accordingly for setting priorities, and then think in terms of strategy. This is one where the corporate citizenship area should take the lead. This is one where PR should take the lead. This is one where government affairs should take the lead. But chances are there's a role for the others to collaborate. That's the conversation I think that needs to take place more often. Rather than government affairs setting their policy agenda, CSR saying, what does the CEO want us to do? What's our sustainability strategy? And what are our competitors doing? And then let that drive what we do.
Right.
But if there's more coordination, I think you're going to see companies finding the synergies that are there and how to help each other and therefore have a greater impact.
Okay, I had to go there. I didn't promise anyone I wasn't going to use this word, but I was kind of going to limit my use of it. But that sounds almost like shared value.
It does. I thought you were going to say synergy, but it does sound like shared value. Yes, it's very true.
Those that play the drinking game here, they also drink to the word shared value.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, the words that people drink on are shared value, sustainability, and I forget, they're like
paradigm shift.
Paradigm shift. They're like 3 or 4 that they do. But okay, I gave you one on the shared value. Cheers.
It's water.
But that does sound like shared, like having a shared value strategy coming into the public
Only less
affairs
academic,
realm.
yeah. I do think there's value to think about, first of all, reputational and public policy issues at the same time. I think that alone gets companies thinking more creatively of where collaboration opportunities lie.
And to that point, now circling back on another part that you just mentioned is that there's a halo effect at the technology firms. What is it that the technology guys are doing that maybe some of the other industries should really look at and study?
Well, first of all, let me say, I don't want to give undue credit to companies who just happen to be in the tech sector because there is a halo effect of just being a tech company now. And if I were a tech company, I'd take advantage of that opportunity. Just there is a negative effect associated with being a bank right now. And you may be the world's greatest bank, most honorable bank, but you're operating at a deficit. And it's just, the way things are.
Yeah.
But let me say one thing I think that a number of tech companies do well, and that's the way they talk about political engagement online. Again, now, I got to say, I am not necessarily supportive of some of the work of the Center for Political Accountability, which is a shareholder rights group that just came out with their annual study of who are the most politically transparent companies, because I have issues. Well, first of all, I have an issue, as I blogged about recently, that their basic assumption is that political engagement is risky. So therefore, companies better be afraid of it, because I don't believe that. I think they should be afraid of not being engaged in politics. But like anything else, it's a business strategy that has risks and opportunities. But so I have some issues with that group and some of their principles. But some of what they do does make sense. I think there are a number of tech companies who are leaders in how you talk about political involvement. It's not just releasing the numbers of our campaign contributions, it's giving context. And companies like HP, and I mentioned Cisco, and eBay is another one that really, it's good use of language, and I would encourage you to check out their websites. There's some of the better ones in discussing why we get involved in politics and why we contribute to various groups and why we think this is strategically important. I think there's not really a downside to doing that, especially if you set the terms of what is proprietary and what is the kind of thing that is in the public interest in releasing.
You know, and I think that that's really important, is that one of the things about those companies that they seem to be doing really well is creating kind of a dialogue. Mm-hmm. The tech companies tend to be developing kind of a stakeholder relationship rather than kind of a one-way.
That's very true.
This is the thing that we're going to tell you all. Here's our statement. This is our thing. It's almost, it's almost as though it's not transparency per se that's important, but that the fact that it's the engagement.
It's building rapport with your audience, and it's showing that you're thoughtful. A number of years ago, Nike did a sustainability report where they talked about why they get involved in politics. And there's a famous favorite line I have in that you'd be interested in. They talk about the fact that they belong to the U.S. Chamber. And here's why we belong to the U.S. Chamber, and they help us a lot on these certain key issues. And there's some issues we don't agree with the Chamber on. And every year we look at our dues and we look at the pros and cons and we make a decision, and we think we've made a thoughtful decision. If you have feedback, we welcome it. And I read that and I thought, what a well-put statement. That the fact that we as a company don't just blindly contribute to groups, or we don't blindly get involved in politics, we really think about it. And if anyone out there has an opinion, we actually welcome it. We won't fight that.
Well, I tend to think of that as really mature, is the idea that you're not going to agree with anyone 100% of the time, and you're not going to disagree with anyone 100% of the time. Let's focus on the constructive parts of the relationship. Right. And I think that companies, you know, particularly consumer products companies, and you know who does a great job with this is Campbell's and American Express, mm-hmm. And not outside of the tech sector of trying to encourage that dialogue. And mm-hmm. But before we go to the next piece here, you know, one of the things that I get concerned about is this idea of CSR as a Trojan horse for introducing kind of anti-business agendas, mm-hmm. and attitudes and things like that. Is that on your radar screen at all?
Well, even in terms of groups who are who have a very specific political agenda, and they're saying you're not
at the top of the program, we talked about kind of the single interest groups, right, with the ratings and whatever, and you can't.
It's a tough, again, my advice to companies is typically, you know, define yourself. Spend some real thoughtful time deciding how you want to be viewed and how you're going to define yourself. And look at those areas where you ought to be making a contribution to society and do it. And that way, when a group comes along and says, you're not doing enough in this area, you can say, well, actually we are. And in fact, the way we're doing it, we think is more strategic than what you're trying to require us to do. You don't want to be caught unawares when someone comes to you with an issue that absolutely has everything to do with your industry sector and you're doing nothing. When I used to work in the natural gas industry, I would always be saying to the companies, despite the fact that natural gas is like the safest fuel, you know, in terms of transportation, the reality is if there is an explosion and natural gas is related, it's going to make the headlines. It doesn't matter whether factually it is a commonplace occurrence or not, it's just reality. So every gas company needs to have a consumer safety program, and it needs to have a robust one. And if you don't, you know, shame on you, because sooner or later a group's going to come to you and demand to know what you're doing in the area of safety.
Right. You know, this is the other thing that I would just say in general, is that as you look at kind of ratings and rankings and who's doing what, everybody's got an agenda. Mm-hmm. Really, you know, and so one of the things that I would just advise any company trying to consider which ones that they do is to research who's behind it and what it is that they stand for and what they want to do. And I think that another element of this is that we may start to see a little bit of standardization and a little bit of people kind of migrating to 2 or 3 platforms just because they kind of develop kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval, if you will. They develop a thing of being kind of objective and whatnot. But right now, it just seems to me that there's still a very high degree of subjectivity in this
Absolutely.
space. So, well, I want to turn it over again to Aman and see if we've triggered anything this time.
Well, your talk about tech companies has got some people talking, and there's a question relating to the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. What about companies like IBM who don't make it to that index but are doing great work?
Well, you know, again, this is one of those things where IBM is a classic case study. They're up as a finalist actually this year for the Corporate Stewardship Award, and you know, IBM helped to build the Social Security Administration during the height of the Depression because they wouldn't lay anybody off. This is a company that's had a certain sense of corporate citizenship, of really stepping up for, you know, practically, you know, over 100 years now. So on some of these things, sometimes the brand identity of the company itself can carry it regardless of whether or not there's an external label or not on it.
Yeah, and they're another good example of a company whose global outreach and business development and public affairs strategies are very much linked to their CSR, you know, effort, their whole Smarter Planet approach. And I mean, it's a wonderful brand for IBM, and it carries them in their international business. So whether or not they score well on an index doesn't matter if they score well on enough other things, including, you know, success in the marketplace, which I think it's actually a good example of showing the limits of some of these various yardsticks that are used to measure performance.
Seriously, and the other thing too is that, you know, because they're using kind of that smart language, Smarter Planet,
Yeah,
smart whatever.
well done.
There's definitely a positive worldview, a positive philosophy embedded in what they're talking about, a thing of improvement, but they are not couching it as CSR.
Yeah.
They're couching it
That's
as
true.
part
That's a
of
good
their
point.
business. And they could be a case, I could totally
Well,
see
I
some people.
would put GE in the same category, where they've integrated a lot of their what used to be corporate responsibility into their overall, you know, eco-imagination program and other related efforts.
Yeah, I mean, it so wouldn't surprise me if a certain faction of your membership would start saying, listen, I don't need the CSR label anymore. I'm going towards, this is my business operations, and I want to associate my business DNA with a sense of constant improvement. And I don't want to even have
but
it
that doesn't
as,
mean, it doesn't mean you're getting rid of the
fun
function,
thing.
just not to scare people. But it gets integrated into the overall business strategy, and there is absolutely a role at a management level for you know, being the eyes and ears to the company and making sure they stay on track with what their commitments are. And also, I think it's important to counter some of the sales and marketing people who tend to want to declare victory. We're the best company, we're the greenest company, and want to use that for competitive advantage. I think it's up to the CSR executive to make sure they stay aspirational, to say we will become the best someday with your help, you stakeholders out there, and to keep the company humble.
Yeah, seriously.
That's important.
I don't think you can ever say you're the best. You can say you're getting better, right?
We're getting better every year.
That's right. And that was a great question. What else have you got?
Also, the question about millennials has a few people talking. There was a comment about my generation is coming to be fans of big business, but does that mean big business is finally getting their CSR voice heard? Are we just getting better at PR? That last bit I added from my own self, but
well, I
are
think,
businesses starting to get?
I think a lot of big companies, especially the brand companies, are not only, you know, getting some of that Facebook stuff and doing social media, you know, as sort of a sideline strategy.
That thing.
Yeah, that thing. The thing my kids do. They're really integrating it in very creative ways to build conversations with their audience. I mean, again, companies like Home Depot, who you would never think would be the kind of culture where they would get good at this, they're getting very good at this. And part of it is realizing they have to reach the next generation of customers, and not just be reaching, you know, 50, 60-year-old homeowners. And that they better be a little more informal, and they got to be able to take some risks and not send a message through, you know, 12 approvals before they respond to a tweet. And I think that's the kind of thing it takes to reach millennials.
But you know, from a corporate culture standpoint, that is so scary.
Oh, it is. It is. But you know, that's why you have to kind of, and I'm mentioning them by name because that's you got to be willing to let go a little bit. And there's a payoff in doing that, because meanwhile your competitors are looking at it in the legal departments, changing the language, and you've already come back with some little irreverent comment that, you know, is not that big a risk, but it shows that you're a bunch of human beings, And I think there's a lot to be said for a company that comes off as a bunch of human beings as opposed to a big monolithic institution.
You know, how in Mad Men, the series that's originally was set in the early 1960s, and they've got a thing of them having a picnic in a park and just throwing away the garbage right there, just casually as a way to shock the modern viewer. I kind of wonder what like a 1962 person coming to today would look at in terms of the change in cultural mores and just the change in values and the way people look at things.
It's very different.
Aman, time for one last question.
Those were a couple of the ones that stood out. I think it would be helpful if you guys can talk a little bit more about the data in the survey that Doug mentioned in the beginning. Maybe piece that out and...
Yeah.
I'm going to mention one more thing that I touched on very briefly is there's a couple of areas of the survey where it seemed like the public was schizophrenic, but if you look below the numbers, I think it starts to make sense. One of them was lobbying. Another one I mentioned briefly was attitudes on regulation. We said, what is the bigger threat? Is it too much regulation of business, or is it too much power in the hands of corporations? And if you look back again over a number of years, we've asked this question, but Pew had asked it some time ago. It hasn't shifted that much. Since the recession, people have now started to tip toward too much regulation of business is the greater danger. So, of course, we know the people who hire pollsters more than anyone are political candidates, right? So, you know, everyone running for Senate, and Obama and Romney all have their own pollsters. They clearly have asked that question. Because if you listen, certainly to the conversation on the Republican side, but even if you listen to certain things that the president has said in the last year or two, there's been some tweaks in the language. It's not so much anti-regulation that, you know, we need smart regulation because we don't want to have a burden on companies that that prevents them from creating jobs. I think candidates are starting to kind of get that message. Certainly on the Republican side, they do. But what's interesting, again, is that we drilled down and said, what about specific types of regulation? Just like with lobbying, when you get specific and you say, well, what about regulation of banks? What about regulation of workplace safety, consumer protection laws, clean air laws? If anything, the most common response is we don't have enough regulation. So that's sort of a warning sign for companies out there. It's not that there's an overwhelming number who say we have to have more, but more people said there's not enough than said there's too much. So when you get specific, people, they want the meat in their dinner inspected. They want to breathe clean air. They want to know that when they sign an agreement for a new mortgage, that nothing is being done to them that might cost them their home in some future years through some sort of, you know, special legal language. So people want rules of the game. So I think one of the takeaways I would say from this study for both presidential candidates is that for Obama, he needs to understand that people don't hate big companies perhaps as much as he would lead them to believe in some of his speeches. And I think for Romney, it's that people don't inherently hate regulation as much as he thinks. I think it's smarter to talk about, and for companies too, to talk about we need smart regulation and regulation that achieves its intended purpose as opposed to needless regulation. And I think in terms of the corporate rhetoric, it's not that, you know, big companies are bad or big companies are taking money from the little guy. It's that there are very responsible companies and there are some bad players. You know, and as a consumer, you should differentiate. And as a society, we need to find a way to reward those who, you know, are acting honorably, and you punish those who aren't. And that's part of the rule of law as well.
See, the other way that you could also say it is that if the message of the companies that really are caring about the environment, really are caring about the water, really are caring about kind of the quality of the food, if the message was getting out that these were the companies that were really doing that kind of thing, you wouldn't necessarily need to, you wouldn't necessarily have that kind of regulatory fear.
That's right.
If you will, if that CSR function. I see, and this is something that I've been trying to make the connection with, is that the companies that really kind of show that they are integrating what people care about are the ones that are least require regulation. As if you know, that there actually is a correlation between promoting CSR practices and kind of not just smart regulation, but just more trust that you don't need to be regulated as much.
Right. That's true.
So we're getting here towards the end. What's the last word?
The last word, I think, is that we, in an increasingly transparent world in the digital age, it's more important than ever for companies to have meetings, or virtual or otherwise, with people in government affairs, communications, CSR, and maybe even investor relations and marketing, and regularly talk about the issues you have in common, to set common goals. You know, they're not your issue, they're the company's issue, to talk about the right strategies and methods for collaboration. And I think if you do that, you know, you'll find it's really one of the keys to success in the kind of world we live in now.
Yeah, I really encourage you, if you haven't, check out the Pulse survey on www.pac.org.
Yep.
Right? And
we have a microsite. If you do pac.org/pulse, you'll find it.
Right. Want to thank Aman Singh from CSR Wire. Mm-hmm. Been great dialogue as always. Doug Pinkham with the Public Affairs Council. I'm Stephen Jordan. Programming note, we're going to have our Global Corporate Citizenship Conference October 10th to the 12th. Hope you'll join us there. And also, please continue to stay engaged with us. Thank you so much.